Hello, everyone. Well, thank you for joining me for another Sunday. I have my special shamanic hat on today to give a slight indication about the depths of where we're going to go today. I suggest you put on your brain seatbelts. Actually, it's probably, I should probably level with you, because more likely than that is this more represents where we're going today. Yes. Dr. Jeff Tripmeister into the depths of chronic reality. All because of a little article that I read in another late edition of Scientific American. And as all things in the great cosmos goes, which have the most pithy content. The only time in space that I've got to read articles like this is, of course, in the bathroom. So once again, great cosmic phenomenon are grounded in the toilet room. But I must say that when I was reading this little article in here, which we'll get to in a minute, I had one of those, what I call holy shit moments. So before we begin, I think as usual, I will pop up the this address where you can get today's soundtrack. That's scientificsounds.com/the Phononic Universe. Phononic meaning sound. And then here is where you can go to get any questions or comments you would like to leave or ask. scientificsounds.com/ask-a-question. And lastly, this is where you can go to my YouTube channel to see all of the live streams I've done up to this point. And for those of you who are new, that's my advice. Go back to the very first one. That was last year in April, right after the pandemic closed the world down. I stepped forward with these live streams. At the end of each live stream, we listen to a soundtrack, and we do it with headphones, so have some headphones ready. We're doing a linking of everybody's brains together, brainwaves together, through everyone listening to a simultaneous soundtrack with binaural beats that entrain everybody's brainwaves to the same place. Power in numbers. Also, I am I'm now starting a series of one-day online webinars, and you can go to this address, Center for Neuroacoustic Research.com/webinars. Another way is my regular address, which is down here at the bottom, scientificsounds.com. And at the top of the header, you'll see a bunch of tabs, and one of those tabs will be called webinars. So you can click that and see all the ones I'm doing on sound and anatomy and physiology of the body and brain entrainment and expanding consciousness and all that with sound waves and stuff. So today I'm drawing a few things together that I have discussed in previous live streams about the quantum physics of sound, phonons. Phonons are to sound as photons are to light. And so light, as we know, is both a particle and a wave. So the wave properties of light cause certain phenomena to happen in scientific experiments. And then other results of those experiments seem to not make sense if light is a wave, because it appears more as if light is made of little particles. And those particles are called photons. And we see a similar thing with sound waves. Sounds also exist as a wave, and those waves are made of little particles called phonons. Phonon, photon. So it's the big yin-yang thing of photons, light, electromagnetism, and mechanical energy waves, pure energy moving through a medium. And if the frequencies of the wave happen to fall between 20 and 20,000 hertz, then our ears were designed to pick those up and interpret those in our brain, and we call that portion sound. But once it goes beyond either of those two brackets, it's still there. It's just higher and higher frequencies than we can hear, or lower and lower and lower frequencies than we can hear. And immediately once it goes beyond 20 hertz down at the bottom, goes lower than that, we begin to feel it in our bodies with a separate sense organ that we've developed called the vibrational sense network in the largest organ of our body, which is our skin. 4 skin sensors, nerve bundles, buried in different depths of the skin, each bundle sensitive to a different vibrational frequency range. And across all 4 bundles, that frequency range is 0.3 hertz to 500 hertz. Those signals go into the posterior spinal cord, up into the brainstem, where there's special neurons called cuneatus and gracilis. And those process vibrational sense, cross over to the opposite side, go straight up through the brainstem, through the cerebellum, up into the thalamus, cross out into the cortex, where they are interpreted in the post-central gyrus, which is a section of the brain up here that receives sensory information from this vibrational sense network. And from all kinds of networks, pain, cold, heat, position sense, all kinds of sensors spread out through your body, trillions of them, collecting all kinds of information. One of those kind of information is vibration sense. And by the way, if you remember from previous ones, the vibration sense pathways, the tracks in the spinal cord that go up to the brainstem, those tracks that carry vibration sense are 3 to 5 times larger surface area than any other sense we have. So therefore, vibrational sense is of supreme feeling the pressure waves of phonons, of sound waves, below hearing. There is a crossover zone, by the way, because vibrational sense is between 0.3 and 500 hertz, and hearing is 20 hertz to 20,000. There's this crossover zone where we both hear it and feel it between 20 and 500 hertz. So therapeutically, if I use a specially designed sound table, which has low frequency transducers that are designed specifically to produce sound waves between 20 and 500 hertz to activate this system. So vibrational sense network activating systems, activating delivery systems for low frequency sound waves to activate this system. And at the same time I'm laying on this sound table, I've got headphones on. And the headphones are producing 20 to 20,000 hertz. I'm automatically synchronizing hearing and vibrational sense networkation between 20 and 500 hertz, where they both overlap. So that would be part of my job as a composer, a musician, and a sound engineer, to combine that information with my knowledge as a physician, with extensive knowledge of anatomy and physiology and how the brain works and how the body's put together, to combine those two worlds together so that I can specifically make soundtracks that maximize the synchronicity of those two systems with instrumentation within that frequency bandwidth between 20 and 500 hertz. Just one element of what's going on in those soundtracks. So in previous live streams, I've covered some of this information. This idea that in the electromagnetic spectrum, which all of us learned in high school, none of us learned about the phononic spectrum, right? The spectrum of sound waves. None of us learned about that. We were taught that everything in the whole universe is a property of photons and light and the electromagnetic spectrum. Everything in the universe is on the electromagnetic spectrum, this whole thing. We use ourselves, human beings, as the standard at 1. Anything larger than us gets a larger number, and beyond Mount Everest would be, the universe, the galaxy, the solar system, the galaxy, the universe. Smaller than us, these numbers would start to go down, and smaller and smaller and smaller. The electromagnetic waves get tighter and tighter and smaller and more rapid per second, more energetic. Someplace in here is the color spectrum, 400 and 750. As our eyeballs are sensitive to this little spectrum, but because we can't see any of these spectrum or any of these spectrums, which is most of it, things become apparent. Things that we see within this spectrum appear to be solid, and things in all of these spectrums appear to be spaces around a solid object. But it's all an illusion of how my eyes are designed and what frequencies I cannot see, just as the same thing with my ear. The only reason I can hear is because of the limitations of what I can't hear below 20 and above 20,000. And that similarly goes along with every sense I have, including ultimately, if you think about it, my thinking process itself. My thinking process itself has a bandwidth in it. It can't see beyond that bandwidth of thinking. And the human brain can't extend beyond is the concept of nothing at the one end and infinity at the other end. And actually that circle closes because nothing is the only mathematical value that by definition has to be infinite, eternal and infinite. If it's nothing, it never started and it will never end. That's eternal. And as I said before, according to Terence Witt, who wrote this book called The Null Universe, where he revamped cosmology completely around the fact that, from the standpoint that if the Big Bang was not something, that if there was no Big Bang, you have to reinterpret the math of the redshift and a bunch of other things. But when you do that, you have an eternal universe that had no beginning and no end, because this is what nothing looks like. All the mathematical relationships of 0 to itself sum to 0 equal relationships of 0 to itself, and those relationships is something that pops out of nothing, and that becomes you and me and everything else. Relationships of information, relationships of math, relationships of a certain relationship of math based on the same kind of relationships we see in music theory that form harmonics and overtones, where waves nest nicely mathematically together in a harmonious relationship, and that forms a chord on a piano, and that seems to be pleasing to us because the deep part of the unconscious mind that designed the universe from a collective consciousness level designed that universe based on the same mathematical laws that we see in music theory. So therefore, when we hear music reiterating that theory, it pleases us because it reiterates back to the deep unconscious mind the same mathematics that you used to design my ear to hear it with, and my brain to conceive of what I'm hearing. It's a curlicue back into reality. But be that as it may, this whole electromagnetic spectrum, where the photon, travels at 186,000 miles per second, which is the speed of light, and according to Einstein and other physicists around the world, you can't go faster than the speed of light. The speed of light is where everything maxes out at infinity. All, of course, from Einstein having a dream that woke him up in the middle of the night where he was dreaming he was riding on a sunbeam. He was interested to know what would the world look like if I was traveling on a sunbeam at the speed of light? Nothing, because at the speed of light, everything becomes white. Everything becomes light. You're outside of time. You're in an eternal present moment where all past and future events take place, and light is everywhere, and there's no contrast between things. We also discussed in the past the concept of sonoluminescence. And that's where you take a beaker filled with something called heavy water, a certain form of water with extra hydrogens. And you put transducers, these are sound transducers here, one on either side. And you put a frequency in this chamber, which is a frequency tuned to the radius of this circle, of this sphere. So that all the sound waves line up exactly in the center. That creates what's called cavitation, creates a bubble, and that bubble expands and then collapses very quickly. And when it collapses, it explodes into a very bright pinpoint of light. Light photons produced from sound waves. Sound wave interactions, tuned correctly, create a pressure wave that expands and then collapses, a little bubble that explodes at the brightness of the sun and hotter than the surface of the sun. This, in my opinion, is the key to fusion reaction, where we have something called deuterium. Deuterium is got a lot of chock full of extra hydrogens, so it's easy to create a sustainable fusion reaction. What happens with this is the cavitation is repetitive. As long as these sound waves are coming through, we have a bubble that forms, it expands, it collapses, creating this burst of light. Then it expands and collapses so rapidly that you can't tell, you can't see the flicker, so it looks like it's a steady light here, but actually it's a series of collapses in microseconds. Phonoluminescence, where sound creates light. Here's a different experiment. So we have another round, spherical chamber with two transducers that are even larger. As I said before, my design for this was a sphere created of speakers, so that there's not just two speakers, but there's speakers all around. So we've magnified the power by 270%. And now the pressure wave at the center is from all these areas, and the sustained phonoluminescence explosion in the center can be maintained, and the level of energy contained there is now magnified greatly. But transducer, spherical chamber, sonoluminescence, flash of the collapse of this, what's called a cavitation collapse of this water bubble, creates heat. And that is essentially the idea behind fusion. We have a sustained, repetitive collapsing with superheat that's hotter than the sun that heats up this water, which is bled off by radiators and as heat and drives turbines. It's an oscillator. And without reading all of this stuff, this is that water bubble that is collapsing into an imploding shock wave that creates this burst of light. It also, other things spin from that, heat spin from that, photons spin from that, electromagnetic frequencies, neutrons, all kinds of things start to happen as a result of that. Quantum acoustics. Surface acoustic waves meet solid-state qubits. They're already talking about how we can harness this energy, and they're doing it in workshops. This is all the way back to 2016. Quantum phononics, which is basically the title of what I'm doing today, which is quantum phonomics, the phononic universe, that more and more research, as we see from more and more articles, particularly from my news feeds over the last decade, have been increasing in their tempo of discoveries that sound seems to be the on, not necessarily light. We were taught that electromagnetic spectrum is the whole universe, but the more we find out that this idea of phonoluminescence, where waves, sound waves, mechanical energy waves, impacting together in a very specific way, cause these cavitation collapses, which create the brightness of a sun or a star and the heat of a star in a little container. But as I had postulated before, we have something that are universally large gravity waves. And gravity waves were first detected positively just a few years ago, made huge news, which formed a huge ripple in space-time, which they call gravity waves. But it's not just colliding photons that do that. They needed colliding photons. They needed a really large-scale event for the gravity waves that came out to be strong enough for us to be able to measure them with our puny instruments. But gravity waves are all over the whole universe, and they're generated by every kind of phenomenon that's out there. The spinning of a star, a planet going around a star, galactic nebula in motion, all of those things are creating gravity waves. It's like swishing my finger around in a still pool of water. That's creating spiraling out waves. And in this case, it's universally large. What's spiraling around is stars and suns and black holes and colliding galaxies and an infinite number of phenomena that are interacting together throughout the universe. And wave patterns spinning out from those interactions. And all those waves are gigantically big. They're, galaxy-sized crests. And a measurement they did 3 years ago showed that a galaxy, the spinning galaxy like Andromeda, is actually because it's riding on top of a gravity wave. These gravity waves are slowly moving through space-time, and all of the galaxies are on top of that wave, riding that wave over millions and billions of years. Wave crest to wave crest is measured in billions of years. it's perceptibly, its slowness is too slow for us to see, and it makes it difficult to grok the idea that the universe is made of waves, and what we call a vacuum is not a vacuum at all. And it's waving a substance that's waving in a certain frequency. The frequency is extremely low, but it is a mechanical energy wave moving through the universe. And that kind of phenomenon is made up of these phonons. And as I said before, phonons, the more they get into measuring phonons, these quantum-sized particles of sound waves, they were thought to be weightless, but now they know they've got mass. They have to have mass, or there couldn't be a pressure wave in a gravity wave. The gravity wave pushes things. That means it has to have mass, even though it might be ever so slight. But the more they started measuring phonons in the laboratory, and they found out that not only does it have mass, it's got negative mass and negative gravity. Sound waves float up. They don't drop down. They defy gravity, and they have negative mass. So this is a whole different ball game going on here. They've got pressure but negative mass. The other thing about the passage of phonons through, where in particular phonons use things like crystalline structures to propagate, and it causes one ball to bump into the next ball, and then this ball stays still and that ball keeps moving. It's like billiard balls. Bang, this one stops, that one keeps moving. Hits this one, that one stops, this one keeps moving, and they just keep going. That they traverse the energy from one to the next to the next to the next. That's how sound waves are moving through the air molecules from my mouth to your ear, so to speak, when we're in a room together. It also turns out that phonons have the power to do something called phonon tunneling, where because phonons and sound waves govern the essence of heat exchange, all heat in the universe is generated from mechanical energy waves passing energy from one thing to the next. And that's because as soon as you have something vibrating, you're energizing structures, and that generates heat. So one of the scientific measurements in a laboratory of measuring phonons and measuring sound waves is how much heat it produces as it vibrates air molecules, or vibrates water molecules, or vibrates molecules in a solid, like the sounding board of a violin. There is heat generated from oscillation. So, for instance, when I'm doing a treatment on my sound table with low-frequency sound waves moving into my body that are attuned to my body, I'm doing testing to find out what frequencies to use to resonate you like a wine glass. That means that that those mechanical energy waves, pure energy moving through that sound table into the water where it's amplified, into my bone structure where it's amplified, and where I talked before about the microtubules that make up the microscopic skeletal structure within a cell and between cells. So there's this massive microscopic microtubular skeletal system spread throughout my whole system. And the microtubules are crystalline structures which have what's called piezoelectric effects. When you distort their shapes, they generate the pressure wave of sound waves distort the cell shapes when the sound waves hit my body, and those cells, when they distort, bends and torques all of the myriad of hundreds of thousands and millions of microtubules that are inside the cell and connect cells together throughout my system. It bends them, generates electrical pulses. So now there's an electrical wave of piezoelectric wave moving through my body that is the counterpart of the sound wave. Once it distorts those tissues, it continues on into my body. as electromagnetic waves and phonons moving as a wave through my body. So as we're talking about, universal-sized mechanical energy waves moving through the universe that they're calling gravity waves. Well, throw that word out too. Why they're calling it gravity waves, I don't know. Nobody really understands gravity. But they are mechanical energy waves where crest to crest to crest are, measured in light years because they're so gigantic, and measured in millions and billions of years crest to crest. It's a whole different thing for the brain to wrap its brain around. But all of the galaxies and all of the nebulae and the billions and trillions of stars are all riding on these crests. But it's not just one pebble with one ripple pattern coming out. It's complex. There's an infinite number of objects in the universe, and each one of them is creating a gravity wave, a mechanical energy wave ripple pattern coming out of that. And all those ripple patterns are starting to interact together. As one ripple pattern meets another, we have these crossover zones where some of those waves cancel each other out, and we have black holes, or in my opinion, and other ones summate, and we have explosions of the sonoluminescence effect, except it's massive and gigantic because the waves that are crossing, the sound waves, the mechanical energy waves that are crossing over each other, are creating gravitation events that are as big as a sun. And therefore the sonoluminescence, that explosion that comes from that, looks to us like a star. And we have the same thing inside of our body. Every cell looks like this. All the fluids in your body are doing this all the time. Our body is being hit by all kinds of mechanical energy wave frequencies all the time that are creating a constellation of ripple patterns, all rippling against each other and creating micro sonoluminescence effects that is liberating photons from these little explosions from sound waves interacting with each other. When I was at the California Institute for Human Science on the faculty there, they had the shielded room experiment, a copper room with copper walls and ceilings and doors, hermetically sealed, 100% dark space, and you put a person in there and you put a photon counter in there, and you can measure photons coming off your body. 1 photon per second per centimeter squared, all over your whole body. You're glowing with photons. Where are those photons coming from? They're coming from the subatomic processes of life itself that is generating these phonoluminescence, these sonoluminescence events from energy waves crossing over each other and creating cavitation events everywhere at a subatomic level, continually all the time. So all kinds of different events take place in the universe that create these gravity waves. Collisions create light across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Because of these phonoluminescence events, I think that these collisions are because the complex nature of all the gravity waves, mechanical energy waves crossing over, are creating points of falling. Things slide towards those. A universe over a galaxy here and a galaxy here are on the crest of a wave, and they're sliding down that crest to its low point and colliding together, and creating explosions. And that creates new ripple patterns that themselves cross over and summate and create new stars. Same thing is happening sort of inside your body. The question is that if the electromagnetic spectrum and photons is at the speed of light, and nothing can go faster than the speed of light, and sound waves are light, 1,700 feet per second sound waves. So how is it possible that these mechanical energy waves in the universe could be challenging electromagnetic frequencies for who started it all, the chicken or the egg, you know? And in reality, sound waves are only measured in air, and sound waves travel at different speeds depending on what they're traveling through. So sound travels more efficiently and faster through water or a fluid or different types or different density solids, balsa wood versus a hardwood that violin sounding board is made of. And in space, we call it a vacuum, so sound can't travel in space. That's not true. It's not space and it's not empty. And these massive, gigantic, galaxy-wide mechanical energy waves are moving through that medium that we call a vacuum. That's not a vacuum, it's a substance. At the core of the quantum field, something is vibrating and forming standing waves. And we can't measure what that something is, but it doesn't mean it's not there. But there we see these traveling quantum waves of phonons are just as fast as photons. And in some cases, these galaxy-wide sound waves are faster than light. And how that's been called quantum tunneling, which happens with phonons. Phonon tunneling is what that's called. I talked about that before in a previous live stream. Phonons have the property of being able to jump from one place to another, like going through a little wormhole. Gravitational waves pass through boundaries that light cannot. They can transport information about what happens inside the event horizon of black holes, and they can pass through the cosmic microwave background radiation, the barrier of light that will always prevent us from seeing the universe before it turned 380,000 years old. They will give us ears into every corner of the cosmos. So by using gravity waves, they're acknowledging that that's phonons, that's sound outside the range of ears to hear it. But these complexity of these crossover waves creates all the interesting, complex, and phonon tunneling gives sound waves the unique ability to tunnel through vacuums and pop out at the other side and generate heat. That's how they measure it. That's why the universe is not at absolute zero. It's just above that. Why? Because these gravity waves are vibrations, and vibrations generate heat. So all heat in the universe comes from phonon resonances that we pick up between 20 and 20,000 hertz and call it sound, or between 0.3 and 500 hertz and we call it vibration. But outside of those ranges where we can't interpret it with an instrumentation of our bodies, it's still there. We just call it by different names. Same stuff. Pure energy moving through a medium at a certain frequency. So from subatomic interactions within the quantum field, where phonons can tunnel through a vacuum in a quantum field and impart information faster than the speed of light, which is part and parcel of what has to be there for a quantum computer to work. That quantum computers, because they have a qubit, which is able to calculate, as a computer, able to calculate all possible parallel events at the same time, instead of like a regular computer with zeros and ones, which is just a bit. they have to, the language of that computer is linear, and all calculations have to happen sequentially in time. But a qubit, a quantum computer, can have all possible calculations rolling forward simultaneously. You can see all possible outcomes of all possible events simultaneously. And it can do it and essentially that's what this is. The most sophisticated quantum computer in the universe. And it's right inside your own head. The more we delve into the mysteries of what's going on inside of this semi-gelatinous mass that we call the brain inside our skulls, the more mind-blowing this whole thing becomes. The level of unimaginable complexity of how neurons are hardwired together with other neurons, thousands and thousands and thousands of connections out of one neuron to all these other neurons. So the number of connections is what dictates IQ, as we saw in Einstein's brain. Einstein's brain was 35% denser and heavier than normal tissue, normal brain, because of the connections between neurons. More connections, it's an array. The level of connectivity gives the density and the heaviness of the brain, and the more neurons talking to other neurons, the more information you can process. And the more information you can process is a measurement of IQ, the intelligent quotient. And the more we delve into this, the more we see that there's this new thing called the connectome, which is, the anatomy of the brain with the neurons and the axons that connect them, where we have clearly hubs of neurons that extend connections out to other hubs. And in particular, when we talk about the default mode network, we have a huge hub of neuron connections back here at the occipital lobe, and a giant hub at the frontal lobe, and two more minor hubs at the parietal temporal zones. And these are all highly synchronized up together in extremely low brainwave activity oscillations, one pulse every 10 to 20 seconds. And all of this gives us our sense of self in time and space, as I've talked extensively before in previous live streams about the default mode network. When these get hyper-synchronized up together, we have experiences of cosmic consciousness. We've now been able to map out the neural pathways of communication in levels of details that we never dreamed possible before, particularly with new types of MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And when it's fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, we can see it as a moving picture. We can see functionality real time. And that's how they discovered the default mode network with fMRI machines. This is the article that started it all for me just last week. The article sitting on my private throne, where this little part down here, let me get this back up. This little part right here, mechanical brains. Do nerves communicate with physical pulses? So here's the article. The Brain Reimagined. Physicists who have revived experiments from 50 years ago. It was rejected because it was too wild and weird. Say nerve cells communicate with mechanical pulses, not electrical pulses. What are they saying here? They're saying that neurons in the brain communicate to other neurons through the axons with sound pulses, not light, not photons, not electromagnetic. And you're going, well, wait a second, EEGs are based on measuring the electrical activity of the neurons firing across these axons in waves of depolarization of electricity. How can you say that? How can you say it's not electrical? And the answer is how phonons in waves interact with other phonons in waves, create and excite the crystalline structure of microtubules and liquid crystals in the lining of the nerves themselves that generate electrical pulses. Actually, there's a mechanical energy wave that's moving down the solid nerve. There's a ripple moving down that nerve, and at the crest of that ripple, it's creating these of the cell walls that make up the myelin sheath around the nerve, and it's distorting those cells, electric events that generates electrical pulses. So actually the electrical pulses that we are measuring are riding at the crest of the wave of a mechanical energy wave that's moving down the nerve. The mechanical energy wave is first, and the excitation of the liquid crystal properties of the cell matrix that makes up the outside of the nerve, along with the microtubules that extend through the nerve, which are crystalline structures that have piezoelectric effects. When you distort them with the sound wave, they generate an electrical pulse. So as that sound wave moves, we have a wave of electrical pulses that are generated by that wave as it moves along. Mind-blowing stuff. How do nerves send signals? The prevailing idea, electrical pulses. In the conventional view, a nerve signal is transmitted in the membrane that makes up the axon's outer wall. The membrane is made of lipid molecules, fat molecules. And lipid molecules have to be there to insulate the nerve from shorting out on other nerves. That's the myelin sheath. Right. So channels in the lipid layer open momentarily, letting sodium and potassium ions, charged particles, flow through the membrane, and then they close. As the opening and closing advances down the axon, it creates a traveling voltage pulse. That's what I learned in school. But down here, the new view, in the mechanical wave view, in the new view, a nerve signal is also transmitted in the axon's membrane, but as a shock wave that travels down the axon. Shock wave meaning a mechanical energy wave. As the wave front advances, it squeezes the lipid molecules that make up the myelin sheath around the nerve, squeezes the lipid molecules, briefly changing them from fluid to liquid crystalline, making them bulge and release heat as the wave passes to the fluid form, narrowing and reabsorbing that heat. So essentially what they're saying is the ripple of the sound wave is moving down the nerve and distorting its shape with the pressure wave. And in the case of the myelin sheath, the lipid membrane on the outside changes from a liquid to a liquid crystal under distortion and pressure, which is a piezoelectric effect, and it generates an electrical pulse. Which means that everything in my brain is run by sound. The electromagnetic things that we're measuring with EEG, and that what I have based all of my brain entrainment work on with EEG studies of the brain and research reports on different states of consciousness associated with different depolarization speeds of brain firings, is actually sound wave ripples moving through the brain. Waves of sound moving through the brain at certain speeds. Once again, this is all what I mentioned in a previous broadcast about microtubules, the crystalline structure, like a liquid crystal of microtubules, that if you distort the shape of these tubules, it generates an electrical pulse because they have piezoelectric effects. And as these microtubules that make up the skeletal structure inside a cell and connect all cells in your body together in a microskeletal scaffolding. And once again, we look at the cell. We have the cell body. We have the axons. This is the myelin sheath, this lipid membrane. Inside the axon, remember, we have microfilaments and microtubules network through the entire system. So as the sound wave squeezes the shape of this nerve, it distorts the shape of the microfilaments, the microtubules, and generates an electrical pulse that rides the crest of that sound wave as it moves down the nerve. I had included this picture in one of the previous live streams, where here is the nucleus of a nerve with the axons coming out, just chock full of microtubules. All of these with distortable tubes that generate electrical pulses on the piezoelectric effect. And that brings new meaning to this article that I had put up before. Scientists discovered biophotons in the brain that could hint our consciousness is directly related to light. And now we see that this is incorrect, because consciousness is directly related to sound. Light is an after effect, that the sound waves moving through the neurons and the axons are distorting the shapes of the microtubules and the lipid membrane and generating piezoelectric discharges that are now being measured by the EEG. Those discharges are being measured by the EEG, but what's causing them is the sound wave moving down the axon. So therefore, consciousness is not directly related to light. It's related to what caused that light to happen, which is mechanical energy waves of pure energy moving down the nerve, sound waves. This is the connectome. All of these microfilaments buried inside of billions and billions of these axon connections. And because sound waves moving along through a network can have the properties of phonon tunneling, that means that the sound waves going down the nerve can actually than the speed of light. That light itself it's actually light itself is trapped by a speed limit, and phonons are not. Phonons can go faster than that through phonon tunneling through another dimension and coming out like a wormhole further down the path and imparting heat. In particular, that's how it happens in space, where there's a vacuum. Phonons can travel through a vacuum and end up further on down the line through a vacuum space that light can't go through. Neural connections through oscillations. The second postulated quantum effect involves cells affecting each other at a distance by oscillations. And that is in two parts. One part is this concept of phonon tunneling, where phonons affecting cells here tunnel through a vacuum and end up someplace else over here, are entangled with the one that it had here before it jumped that gap. And once it jumps that gap, these two are entangled together. So whatever this one does at a great distance. And so what we're talking about here is neuron connections are connected together through a coupled oscillator effect, which is what I believe is underlying the spooky action at a distance. Coupled oscillators are the same thing that makes sympathetic resonance in various strings on your piano, and creates a spooky action at a distance in all kinds of different places in the cortex, in the brain, all communicating together at distant zones from each other through the property of phonon tunneling and spooky action at a distance based on sympathetic resonance, which is based on the law of coupled oscillators. which is the law that governs music theory. So these electrical pulses that we see and that we measure with EEG coming down these axons are actually the crest of a sound wave rippling through and distorting the shape of those membranes and generating piezoelectric discharges at the crest of that wave as it moves. And it gets deeper. DNA begins as a quantum wave. So now we're talking about the structure of DNA itself is the result of cresting sound waves, which generate shapes from the sound waves, similar to what we see with sound waves, making the sand particles dance on the metal plate and form what looks like patterns. Aren't real. They look like they're solid, but they're actually just standing waves of dancing sand particles. And essentially that's what the DNA is. It's dancing sand particles, except it's not sand, it's quantum particles, it's phonons, it's generating photons. It's sound waves moving through the quantum field, and the interactions of these sound waves are generating photons through the phonoluminescence effect. And it's boundless inward in the atom, and it's clearly measurable at galaxy-wide distances, universally wide distances. We see fractal holographic representations in the universe of what we see in microscales at a quantum level. We see the way that our axons are wired together in our brain reflected in super universal networks of lines of communication, of trillions of nebula and galaxies following along these lines that look like axon connections. We could be inside of a giant brain. At the core of it all is a phonon event creating a luminescence event, which generates electrical pulses and creates the electromagnetic spectrum that of all things in the universe that appear to be there. Quantum physics says that as you go deeper and deeper into the workings of the atom, you see that there is nothing there, just energy waves, mechanical energy waves. It says an atom is actually an invisible force field, a kind of miniature tornado, which emits waves of electrical energy. That miniature tornado is a phonon tornado. It's a sound tornado, a mechanical energy wave tornado, generating piezoelectric effects at the very core of reality. The key to everything is interaction between phonons generating photons, in my opinion. That great yin-yang of where what's going on inside of the nucleus of a brain cell and the brain is mimicked in the universe at large. And at the core and the center of it is my consciousness, that's somehow linked to this mechanical energy wave generating photons measured as electrical activity on an EEG. My force of consciousness from the ancient texts is what the substrate of all reality actually is. It's when you get to the smallest particle at the quantum field, there's something in a state of resonance forming standing waves, and according to the ancient text, that's consciousness itself. It's not a vacuum, it's a thought that generates ripples in space-time, changes everything. It's me getting to a place inside myself before a thought where I can change reality itself by generating space-time ripples from my thought processes before a thought. Raw thinking, raw imagery. The place we're trying to go with these mind links, we're trying to get everybody's brains to this place before a thought where I can imagine what kind of world I want. And if we have enough brains linked together with that thought, the ripples in space-time that come from that interaction, where the force of power of numbers generates a communication with the information processing centers of the universe at large, and creates a new reality. Spooky action at a distance in your own brain, where brains link together and become entangled, where we generate on purpose a sort of a quantum sympathetic resonance effect based on coupled oscillators, where all of us become aware of the fact that we are just information, that we're nodes of information, that what we appear to be is not what we are. We're pure energy interacting, creating everything in the universe. Here's a cool quote. Concerning matter, we have all been all wrong. What we have called matter is energy, whose vibration has been so slowed as to be perceptible to the senses. There is no matter. Human beings, vegetables, cosmic dust, we all dance to a mysterious tune, intoned in the distance by an invisible piper. Albert Einstein. So, that being said, now we have a soundtrack to place us there and link ourselves together in a coupled oscillator whole to generate an idea that we're here to figure out. What is the idea we want to generate, and what kind of world do we want? The best place is to open yourself up to allow the universe to fill that vision, because the universe already has a plan and you have a piece in that plan. Open yourself up to allow the universe to drop that information into you or synchronize up with it. So here we go. Everyone close your eyes, and here we go. Here's the address of that soundtrack. These soundtracks stay up for 1 week. Make sure you grab it and save it to your computer. It'll be replaced by the one the week after, and then it won't be available anymore. Here this weekend, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you all. Be happy and healthy and holy, and thank